Growing up in suburban Denver, Colorado, I never imagined that my biggest betrayal would come from the person who shared my childhood bedroom. My name is Rachel Whitmore, and this is the story of how my sister Cassandra destroyed what I thought was love, only to discover she'd actually saved me from wasting my life on someone who never deserved me in the first place. But the real twist? She had no idea who I'd become while she was busy stealing my past. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I met Derek Morrison on a rainy Thursday afternoon in October 2018 at Boulder Coffee House, just off the University of Colorado campus. I was 24, finishing my master's degree in economics, drowning in research papers about monetary policy and federal banking regulations. He walked in shaking raindrops from his dark hair, wearing a leather jacket that looked expensive but worn, like it had stories to tell. What struck me first wasn't his looks, though he was undeniably handsome with those sharp green eyes and confident smile. It was the way he carried himself, like he owned every room he entered, like the world owed him something good. I was hunched over my laptop, surrounded by empty coffee cups and highlighter-stained printouts, probably looking like I hadn't slept in days. Because I had. "Mind if I share your table?" he asked, gesturing to the packed cafe. "Everywhere else is taken, and you look like someone who appreciates good company." I should have said no. I had a thesis deadline looming, 3 job applications to finish, and a phone interview with the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City the next morning. But something about his easy confidence made me close my laptop and nod toward the empty chair. Derek worked in digital marketing for a startup downtown, something involving social media analytics, that he explained with the kind of enthusiasm that made you believe he was changing the world one click at a time. He had opinions about everything: the best hiking trails in Rocky Mountain National Park, why craft beer was superior to anything mass-produced, and how traditional economic models were completely outdated in the digital age. That last point should have been a red flag. I'd spent 3 years studying those outdated models, understanding their evolution, their applications, and their critical importance in maintaining financial stability. But when Derek dismissed my field of study with a casual wave of his hand, I found myself laughing instead of defending my life's work. "You're too smart for all that theoretical stuff," he said, leaning back in his chair like he'd just solved my life's greatest puzzle. "You should be doing something more practical, more real world. Maybe I could get you an interview at my company." I didn't tell him about the Federal Reserve interview. I didn't mention that I'd already completed internships at 2 major banks, or that my undergraduate thesis on cryptocurrency regulation had been published in an academic journal. Instead, I smiled and let him believe he was introducing me to concepts I'd never considered. Our first official date was dinner at a trendy restaurant in downtown Denver, the kind of place where the portions were small but the atmosphere was supposed to make up for it. Derek ordered wine without asking what I preferred, recommended dishes based on what he thought I'd like, and spent most of the evening talking about his ambitious 5-year plan to launch his own marketing agency. "I'm thinking of expanding into financial services marketing," he said, cutting into his steak with precise movements. "There's so much money in that sector, and most of those firms have no idea how to reach younger demographics. I could revolutionize how banks communicate with potential clients." I nodded and asked questions that made him feel clever, even though I could have explained exactly why his proposed strategies wouldn't work within current regulatory framework. But Derek seemed to enjoy having an audience for his grand visions, and I found myself oddly charmed by his confidence, even when it was misplaced. The relationship developed quickly, perhaps too quickly. Within 3 months we were spending most weekends together, and Derek had started leaving clothes at my apartment. He had a key by February, and by spring we were talking about moving in together after my graduation. Derek loved having a girlfriend who was so driven and intellectual, as he put it to his friend. He'd introduce me at parties as Rachel, the economics genius, usually followed by some joke about how I could probably predict stock market crashes or explain why Bitcoin was going to take over the world. His friends would laugh, and I'd smile politely, not mentioning that cryptocurrency analysis was actually a significant part of my current research. The problem wasn't that Derek didn't respect my intelligence, He did in his own way. The problem was that he saw my education and career ambitions as interesting accessories to my personality rather than fundamental parts of who I was. When I got excited about a breakthrough in my research or wanted to discuss a fascinating paper I'd read, his eyes would glaze over after about 30 seconds. "You're so passionate about this stuff," he'd say, usually while reaching for his phone or changing the subject. "It's cute how serious you get about it." Cute? That word should have bothered me more than it did. Meanwhile, my sister Cassandra was going through what she dramatically called her quarter-life crisis. At 22, she'd graduated with a degree in communications and was bouncing between retail jobs, Instagram influencer aspirations, and a series of failed relationships with men who promised her the world and delivered disappointment. Cassandra had always been the prettier sister, at least in the conventional sense, where I was tall and angular with serious brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She was petite and bubbly with naturally blonde hair and the kind of smile that made strangers want to help her with whatever she needed. Growing up, she'd been the one who got cast in school plays while I'd been building model rockets for science fairs. She'd been a homecoming princess while I'd been captain of the debate team. Our parents, David and Margaret Whitmore, had always been careful to treat us equally, but it was impossible to ignore that Cassandra seemed to glide through life on charm and good looks while I had to work twice as hard for everything I achieved. Not that I resented her for it much. We'd been close as children, sharing secrets and defending each other against playground bullies, but somewhere around high school we'd drifted into different orbits. She'd surrounded herself with the popular crowd, while I'd found my place among the academic achievers and future leaders. By college, we were living completely different lives, connected mainly through family dinners and holiday traditions. When I started dating Derek, Cassandra was immediately fascinated by him. She'd find excuses to drop by my apartment when she knew he'd be there, always looking perfectly put together in a way that seemed effortless, but probably took an hour of preparation. She'd laugh a little too loudly at his jokes, ask him detailed questions about his work, and somehow always need help reaching something from a high shelf or opening a jar when he was around. "Your sister's really sweet," Derek would say after she left, usually with a smile that lingered a little too long. "She's so different from you, though. More, I don't know, spontaneous." I should have paid more attention to those comments. I should have noticed how his posture changed when Cassandra walked into a room, how his voice got slightly deeper when he talked to her, how he always seemed to have advice for whatever crisis she was navigating that week. Instead, I was buried in my final semester coursework and the increasingly demanding interview process for positions I'd applied for across the country. The Federal Reserve had moved me through 3 rounds of interviews, each more intensive than the last. I was simultaneously applying for analyst positions at the Treasury Department, the Congressional Budget Office, and several Federal Reserve banks in different regions. Derek knew I was interviewing for government jobs, but I'd learned not go into detail about the specific roles or their requirements. His eyes would glaze over when I mentioned monetary policy or financial regulation, and he'd usually respond with something about how I was too creative for bureaucracy or how I should think bigger about my career prospects. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was potentially about to join one of the most powerful financial institutions in the world while my boyfriend thought I was settling for a boring desk job pushing papers for the government. By May 2019, I was juggling final exams, thesis defense preparation, and what felt like a dozen different interview processes. The stress was overwhelming, but I was also exhilarated by the possibilities opening up before me. Everything I'd worked for since high school was finally coming together. That's when I started noticing the small changes in Derek's behavior. He was less available for our usual weeknight dinners, claiming increased demands at work. When we did spend time together, he seemed distracted, checking his phone more frequently and sometimes smiling at messages he didn't share with me. "Just work stuff," he'd say when I asked, but something about his tone suggested otherwise. I was too focused on my own future to dig deeper into what was really going on. I trusted Derek, trusted that whatever was bothering him would work itself out once the stress of graduation season passed. I trusted my sister too, despite the way she'd been hanging around more often lately, always seeming to need something right when Derek and I were settling in for a quiet evening together. Trust, it turned out, was going to be my biggest mistake. The first crack in my carefully constructed reality appeared on a Tuesday evening in late May. I'd just finished defending my thesis successfully with honors, and was practically floating on adrenaline and relief. My committee had praised my work on digital currency regulation frameworks, and Professor Martinez had pulled me aside afterward to say it was some of the most sophisticated graduate-level analysis she'd seen in years. I rushed home to share the news with Derek, stopping to grab champagne and his favorite Thai takeout on the way, but when I burst through the door of my apartment, keys still in hand and arms full of celebration supplies, I found it empty. Not just empty, carefully cleaned, like someone had been expecting company that never arrived. Derek's laptop wasn't on the kitchen table where he usually worked. His jacket wasn't thrown over the back of my chair. The coffee mug he'd left that morning was washed and put away, which was unusual since Derek's relationship with household chores was casual at best. I called his phone while unpacking the food, expecting to hear about some last-minute work crisis or impromptu happy hour with his colleague. It went straight to voicemail. I tried again 20 minutes later, then again an hour after that. By 10 p.m. I was genuinely worried. Derek always answered his phone, especially when he knew I might be calling with news about my thesis defense. The next morning, I woke up to a text sent at 2:47 a.m. "Sorry babe, got pulled into a work emergency, crashed at Jake's place. Congrats on the thesis thing. We'll celebrate this weekend." A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The thesis thing. 3 years of research, months of preparation, and the successful defense of work that could influence federal policy decisions, reduced to the thesis thing. But I pushed down my irritation and focused on the more pressing concern. Derek had never mentioned any work emergencies, serious enough to keep him out all night. His startup was successful, but hardly the kind of operation that required crisis management at 3 a.m. I decided to surprise him at his office with lunch, partly to celebrate belatedly and partly to satisfy my growing unease about his recent behavior. But when I arrived at the sleek downtown building where his company occupied the 3rd floor, the receptionist looked confused when I asked for Derek Morrison. "I'm sorry, Derek's been working remotely for the past 2 weeks, she said, checking something on her computer screen. "Some kind of special project. I can try calling him if it's urgent." 2 weeks. Derek had been leaving my apartment every morning for 2 weeks, dressed for work, carrying his laptop bag, complaining about meetings and deadlines. Where had he been going? I spent the rest of that Wednesday in a strange state of suspended anxiety, trying to focus on job interview preparations, while my mind kept circling back to Derek's mysterious disappearances. By evening, I'd convinced myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe he was working on a confidential client project. Maybe he was planning some kind of surprise. Maybe I was overthinking everything because of graduation stress and job interview pressure. That's when Cassandra called, her voice unusually subdued. "Hey Rachel, can you come over to my apartment? I need to talk to you about something, and it's kind of important." Cassandra lived in a trendy complex in the Highlands neighborhood, the kind of place with exposed brick walls and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked expensive but was actually affordable because the sound insulation was terrible and the parking situation was a nightmare. She decorated it with the Instagram-worthy aesthetic she was known for: fairy lights, succulents, and enough throw pillows to stock a small furniture store. But when I arrived, the usual perfectly curated atmosphere felt different. Cassandra was wearing sweatpants and an oversized hoodie, her hair pulled back in a messy bun that actually looked messy instead of strategically disheveled. She wasn't wearing makeup, which was so unusual it was almost alarming. "I've been thinking about how to tell you this," she said before I'd even sat down, her hands fidgeting with the sleeves of her hoodie. "And I keep going back and forth about whether I should say anything at all, but I think you deserve to know." A cold knot formed in my stomach. "Know what?" Cassandra took a deep breath, looked directly at me for the first time since I'd arrived, and said, "I've been seeing Derek." The words hit me like a physical blow. Not Derek asked me out, or Derek and I went on a date. Seeing. Present tense. Ongoing. Established. "What do you mean, seeing him?" I heard myself ask, though part of me already knew exactly what she meant. "I mean we've been together for about 3 weeks now," she said, And there was something in her voice, not quite defiance, but not shame either. Something closer to resignation, like she was reporting an inevitable outcome rather than confessing a betrayal. 3 weeks, which meant it had started right around the time Derek began working remotely, right around the time he started being less available, less present, less mine. "How long has this been going on?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Cassandra sat down across from me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. It started kind of gradually. "You know how he's been helping me with my LinkedIn profile and job search stuff. We were texting about that, and then it became more frequent. And then," she trailed off, shrugging like the progression from career advice to romantic involvement was as natural as water flowing downhill. I remembered Derek mentioning that he was giving Cassandra some professional guidance, and remembering feeling grateful that my boyfriend was being supportive of my sister during her career struggles. How perfectly I'd been played. "Where has he been going every morning?" I asked. "His office said he's been working remotely. He's been coming here," Cassandra said quietly. "Working from my apartment. We thought, we thought it would be easier if he had a quiet place to focus while we figured out how to tell you." Figured out how to tell me. Like my relationship ending was a logistical problem they needed to solve together rather than a betrayal that had already happened. "So, while I was preparing for thesis defense, while I was interviewing for jobs, while I was planning our future together, you two were what, playing house in your apartment?" Cassandra's composure cracked slightly. "It wasn't like that. It wasn't planned. It just happened, Rachel. Sometimes these things just happen." But looking at her face, seeing the guilt mixed with something that looked almost like relief, I realized this wasn't a spontaneous mistake or a moment of weakness that had spiraled out of control. This was a decision she'd made, a choice she'd been working toward for months. "How long have you wanted this?" I asked, and the question surprised both of us. She was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. When she finally looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice was steady. "I never wanted to hurt you," she said, which wasn't an answer to my question, but was probably the most honest thing she'd said since I arrived. I left her apartment without saying goodbye, without screaming, without giving her the dramatic confrontation she'd probably been preparing for. I just stood up, grabbed my purse, and walked out, leaving her sitting on her couch, surrounded by fairy lights and succulents, and the ruins of what used to be your relationship as sisters. The drive back to my own apartment passed in a blur of traffic lights and radio static. I kept expecting to feel something: rage, heartbreak, betrayal, devastation. Instead, I felt oddly hollow, like someone had carefully removed something essential from inside me and I hadn't noticed until now. Derek's key was still on my kitchen counter where he'd left it that morning, next to a coffee mug with his company logo and a sticky note reminding me about dinner plans we'd made for Friday. Plans he'd probably forgotten about the moment he walked out my door to spend another day playing house with my sister. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat at my kitchen table, staring at that key and thinking about the past few months with a clarity that felt sharp enough to cut. All those times Derek had seemed distracted during our conversations, all those mysterious work emergencies, all those moments when Cassandra had shown up at exactly the right time to interrupt our evening plans. They'd been planning this, maybe not consciously at first, but planning it nonetheless, and I'd been so focused on my own goals, my own future, my own carefully mapped path toward professional success, that I'd missed every single warning sign. My phone buzzed with a text from Derek. "Hey babe, can we talk tonight? I'll come by around." I stared at the message for several minutes, trying to imagine what version of this conversation he'd been rehearsing. Was he planning to confess? To apologize? To try to explain why my sister was a better choice than I was? I typed back, "I already know. Don't come over." Then I turned off my phone, finished my wine, and started making a list of everything in my apartment that belonged to Derek Morrison. It was a surprisingly short list for someone who'd been part of my life for almost a year, and part of my daily routine for months. By morning, everything that belonged to him was packed in 2 boxes by my front door. His key was in an envelope with his name on it. I'd washed the coffee mug and put it in one of the boxes, along with the clothes he'd left in my dresser, the books he'd never finished reading, and the expensive cologne he'd bought because he thought it made him seem sophisticated. I was done being grateful for Derek's attention. I was done making myself smaller to fit into his vision of who I should be, and I was definitely done pretending that losing him was going to derail the life I'd been building long before he'd walked into that coffee shop. Because the truth was, I had bigger things to think about than Derek Morrison's betrayal. In 6 days, I had a final interview with the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, D.C., for a position that could change everything about my future. Derek had no idea what I was about to become. Neither did Cassandra, and honestly, after the past 24 hours, I was looking forward to showing them both exactly what they'd walked away from. Washington, D.C., in June felt like stepping into a different universe. The humidity hit me the moment I stepped off the plane at Reagan National, but it wasn't just the weather that made everything feel surreal. After 3 days of emotional numbness in Denver, followed by 48 hours of intensive interview preparation, I was finally allowing myself to process what my life had become. The Federal Reserve Board building on Constitution Avenue was exactly as imposing as I'd imagined. White marble columns, American flags snapping in the morning breeze, and an atmosphere of quiet power that seemed to vibrate through the sidewalks. I arrived 30 minutes early for my 10 a.m. interview, using the extra time to walk around the building and center myself. This wasn't just any job interview. If successful, I'd be joining the research staff of the most influential monetary policy institution in the world. The position involved analyzing economic data that would directly inform decisions affecting interest rates, inflation targets, and the stability of the entire American financial system. It was the kind of role that economics students dreamed about, the kind of career launching pad that opened doors most people didn't even know existed. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the senior economist who had been leading my interview process, met me in the marble-floored lobby at exactly 10 a.m. She was a slight woman in her 50s with sharp eyes behind designer glasses and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing you're among the smartest people in any room you enter. "Rachel, welcome to Washington. I trust your flight was comfortable." We walked through security checkpoints that were more thorough than airport screening, past portraits of former Fed chairmen, and into an elevator that required a special keycard. The building felt like a cross between a university library and a high-security government facility, which, I realized, was exactly what it was. The interview panel consisted of 5 senior economists, including Dr. Chen, each representing different areas of Fed research, monetary policy implementation, international finance, banking supervision, financial stability, and economic modeling. They sat around a polished conference table, with folders containing what I assumed were detailed analyses of my academic work, internship evaluations, and recommendation letters. "Before we begin," Dr. Chen said, "I want you to know that we were particularly impressed with your thesis on cryptocurrency regulation frameworks. Your analysis of how traditional monetary policy tools might need to adapt to digital currency adoption was sophisticated beyond what we typically see at the graduate level." For the next 2 hours, they grilled me on everything from inflation targeting strategies to international exchange rate mechanisms. They presented me with theoretical scenarios and asked me to walk them through potential policy responses. They questioned my understanding of quantitative easing, my thoughts on financial stability monitoring, and my ability to translate complex economic data into actionable policy recommendations. But this wasn't like any academic exam I'd ever taken. These weren't questions designed to test memorized knowledge. They were testing my ability to think like a Fed economist, to see connections between seemingly unrelated economic indicators, to understand the human impact of abstract policy decisions. "Let's say core inflation has been running above our 2% target for 6 consecutive months," said Dr. Patricia Russo, the financial stability specialist. "Employment data shows continued growth, but housing market indicators are showing signs of stress. Credit markets are tightening, but not dramatically. Walk us through your analysis of whether the Federal Open Market Committee should consider raising interest rates." I took a deep breath and launched into an analysis that drew on everything I'd learned in graduate school, Every internship experience, every late night spent reading Federal Reserve research papers and historical case studies. I discussed the dual mandate, the importance of forward guidance, the need to balance inflation control against employment considerations, and the potential unintended consequences of policy changes on credit markets. When I finished, the panel exchanged glances that I couldn't quite read. "Excellent," Dr. Chen said simply. "Now, let's talk about something completely different. Tell us about a time when you had to maintain professional objectivity during a period of significant personal stress." The question caught me off guard, partly because it was so far from the technical economic discussions we'd been having, and partly because it felt uncomfortably relevant to my current situation. "Actually," I said, choosing my words carefully, "I'm dealing with exactly that kind of challenge right now. This week I discovered that someone I trusted had been systematically deceiving me for several weeks. My first instinct was to let the emotional impact affect other areas of my life, including this interview process. But I realized that my ability to compartmentalize personal issues and maintain professional focus is exactly the kind of skill that's essential in a role like this." Dr. Martin Webb, the international finance expert, leaned forward slightly. "How do you separate emotional responses from analytical thinking when they're happening simultaneously?" "I think the key is recognizing that they don't have to be mutually exclusive," I said. "Emotional intelligence can actually enhance analytical thinking if you're conscious about how you're processing information. Personal experiences can provide valuable context for understanding human behavior patterns, which is essential when you're making policy decisions that will affect millions of people." The interview concluded with a detailed discussion of my research interests and long-term career goals. They asked about my willingness to relocate to Washington, my comfort level with the security clearance process, and my understanding of the Fed's role in both domestic and international economic policy. "We'll be in touch within 10 days, Dr. Chen said, as we shook hands. "Regardless of our decision, I want you to know that your performance today was exceptional. You have the kind of analytical mind and professional maturity that would be valuable in any economic policy role." I left the building feeling simultaneously exhausted and energized. The interview had gone better than I dared to hope, but more importantly, it had reminded me of who I was when I wasn't trying to make myself smaller for someone else's comfort. That evening, I sat in my hotel room overlooking the Potomac River and called my parents. I'd been avoiding their calls since the Derek situation exploded, not ready to explain why my relationship had ended or deal with their questions about family dynamics and sisterly loyalty. "Rachel, sweetheart, we've been worried about you," my mother said when she heard my voice. "Cassandra told us about the situation with Derek, and we weren't sure if you'd want to talk about it." Of course Cassandra had told them. She'd probably framed it as a tragic accident, a situation that had spiraled beyond anyone's control, rather than a deliberate betrayal that had been months in the making. "I'm okay, Mom. Actually, I'm better than okay. I just finished interviewing for a position with the Federal Reserve Board, and I think it went really well." There was a pause, and I could hear my parents processing this information. "The Federal Reserve?" my father asked, his voice carrying the kind of respect that Derek had never managed when I talked about my career goals. "Rachel, that's incredible. Do you realize what kind of opportunity that represents?" For the first time in days, I felt genuinely happy. Not relieved, not vindicated, not determined to prove something to people who'd hurt me, just purely, simply happy about the path my life was taking. "I know exactly what it represents, Dad. That's why I've been working toward it for years." We talked for another hour about the interview process, about Washington, about the kind of work I'd be doing if I got the position. My parents asked thoughtful questions about monetary policy and economic research, treating my career ambitions with the seriousness they deserved. It occurred to me that I'd been so used to Derek's dismissive attitude toward my field that I'd forgotten how good it felt to have people genuinely interested in my work. When I finally hung up, I realized something had shifted. The hollow feeling that had dominated since Cassandra's confession was gone, replaced by something that felt like clarity. Derek's betrayal had hurt, but it had also revealed something important. I'd been trying to build a relationship with someone who fundamentally didn't understand or value the person I was becoming. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Rachel, it's Derek. I know you said not to come over, but we need to talk about this situation. Can we meet for coffee when you get back to Denver? I think there are things you don't understand about what happened." I stared at the message for several minutes, trying to imagine what possible explanation he thought might justify betraying my trust with my own sister. Then I deleted the text without responding and blocked his number. 3 days later, I was back in Denver, packing up my apartment and preparing for what felt like the next chapter of my life. Whether or not the Fed position came through, I'd made a decision. I was done with Denver, done with the version of myself that had settled for Derek's limited vision of who I should be, and done with pretending that Cassandra's betrayal was something I needed to forgive and forget. The landline in my apartment rang while I was boxing up books. Only one person still called the landline. My elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who occasionally needed help with grocery shopping or technology issues. But when I answered, it was Dr. Chen's voice on the other end. "Rachel, I hope I'm not calling too late. I wanted to reach you personally with the news." The panel was unanimous in their decision. "We'd like to offer you the position of research analyst with the Federal Reserve Board. Starting August 15th, the formal offer letter will arrive by express mail tomorrow. But I wanted you to hear it from me first." I sat down on my couch, surrounded by half-packed boxes and the detritus of a life I was already outgrowing, and felt something that might have been destiny clicking into place. "Dr. Chen, I accept. Thank you for this opportunity." After I hung up, I sat in the quiet of my apartment for a long time, thinking about the strange way life can pivot on moments that seem like endings, but are actually beginnings. Derek and Cassandra had thought they were taking something away from me. Instead, they'd cleared the path for me to become exactly who I was meant to be. Moving to Washington, D.C., in August felt like stepping into a parallel universe where everything I'd studied for years suddenly mattered in ways I'd never imagined. My first day at the Federal Reserve Board began at 6:30 a.m., with a security briefing that covered everything from classified information protocols to emergency evacuation procedures. By 8 a.m., I was sitting in the research division's morning briefing, listening to senior economists discuss overnight developments in Asian markets and their potential impact on U.S. monetary policy. Dr. Chen had assigned me to work under Dr. Michael Torres, a brilliant economist in his 40s who specialized in financial stability monitoring. My first assignment involved analyzing stress test results from major commercial banks, looking for patterns that might indicate systemic risks to the banking sector. It was exactly the kind of work that made Derek's eyes glaze over when I'd tried to explain my career goals, but here, surrounded by people who understood the implications of capital adequacy ratios and liquidity coverage metrics, I felt like I'd finally found my intellectual home. My apartment was a studio in DuPont Circle, small but perfectly located for someone who planned to spend most of her time either at the Fed or exploring the city. I'd deliberately chosen a place that felt nothing like my old life in Denver. Hardwood floors instead of carpet, exposed brick instead of suburban drywall, and windows that looked out onto tree-lined streets where people walked to work, carrying briefcases full of documents that could influence global economic policy. The first few weeks passed in a blur of orientation sessions, security clearance interviews, and intensive training on Fed systems and procedures. I was learning to navigate databases that contained confidential banking information, attending briefings on international economic developments, and drafting analysis reports that would be read by some of the most powerful financial policymakers in the world. But it wasn't just the work that felt transformative, it was the environment, the colleagues, the sense that everyone around me took economic policy as seriously as I did. During lunch breaks, conversations ranged from debate about optimal inflation targeting strategies to analysis of emerging market currency crises. These weren't academic discussions conducted for grades or theoretical exercises designed to test knowledge. These were real-world policy questions with immediate consequences for millions of Americans. 3 weeks into my new position, I was working late on a comprehensive analysis of regional banking trends when my personal phone rang. I almost didn't answer, focused on a particularly complex dataset showing concerning patterns in commercial real estate lending. But something made me glance at the screen, and I saw a Colorado number I didn't recognize. Rachel? Thank God you answered. It's Mom. My mother's voice sounded strained, worried in a way that immediately got my attention. Mom, what's wrong? Why are you calling from a different number? I'm at the hospital with Cassandra. She's okay now, but she was in an accident this afternoon. A car ran a red light and hit her on the passenger side. She has a concussion and some bruised ribs, but the doctors say she's going to be fine. The news hit me like a physical blow. Despite everything that had happened between us, despite the betrayal and the months of silence since I'd left Denver, Cassandra was still my sister. The thought of her injured and scared in a hospital bed made everything else seem suddenly irrelevant. Is she awake? Can she have visitors? She's been drifting in and out of consciousness, but she's stable. Rachel, honey, she's been asking for you. She keeps saying she needs to tell you something important. I looked around my office at the Federal Reserve, at the classified documents spread across my desk, at the analysis that needed to be finished by morning. Then I looked at my watch. 7:30 p.m. on a Thursday. If I left immediately, I could catch a late flight to Denver and be at the hospital by midnight. I'll be there as soon as I can get a flight. Text me the hospital information. Dr. Torres found me in the hallway. 20 minutes later, laptop bag over my shoulder and clearly preparing to leave. Family emergency, I explained briefly. My sister was in a car accident. I need to fly to Denver tonight. He nodded without hesitation. Take whatever time you need. Family comes first. The banking analysis can wait until you get back. The flight to Denver gave me 3 hours to think about everything that had changed in the past few months. The last time I'd seen Cassandra, she'd been confessing to stealing my boyfriend in her Instagram perfect apartment, looking guilty but not quite sorry enough. Now she was lying in a hospital bed, asking for me despite everything that had happened between us. Denver Health Medical Center at midnight was exactly as depressing as every hospital at midnight. Fluorescent lighting that made everyone look sick, the smell of industrial disinfectant, and that peculiar quiet that comes from people trying to sleep despite being surrounded by medical equipment that beeps constantly. I found my parents in the ICU waiting area, both looking exhausted and older than I'd remembered. My mother stood up immediately when she saw me, wrapping me in a hug that felt desperate with relief. She's sleeping now, but she's been asking for you all evening, she whispered. The doctors say the concussion isn't severe, but she's been pretty confused about what happened. My father looked up from the magazine he'd been pretending to read. Rachel, I'm so glad you came. I know things have been complicated between you and Cassandra, but seeing you here, it means everything. The ICU only allowed one visitor at a time during overnight hours, so I found myself alone with my sister for the first time since that awful conversation in her apartment. She looked small and fragile against the white hospital sheets, her usual perfect hair tangled and her face pale, except for a dark bruise along her left temple. Various monitors beeped softly, tracking heart rate and oxygen levels and other vital signs that seemed reassuringly steady. She opened her eyes when I sat down in the chair beside her bed. Rachel? Her voice was hoarse, confused. Are you really here? Or am I dreaming again? I'm really here, Cass. Mom called me about the accident. How are you feeling? She tried to sit up, winced, and settled back against the pillows. Everything hurts, but the doctors say I'm going to be okay. Rachel, I need to tell you something. About Derek. About what really happened. I started to say that we didn't need to talk about Derek right now, that she should focus on recovering, but something in her expression stopped me. The whole thing was my idea, she said quietly, looking directly at me for the first time. Derek didn't pursue me. I pursued him. I've been jealous of you my entire life, and when I saw how happy you were with him, how everything was working out perfectly for you, I couldn't stand it. This wasn't what I'd expected to hear. In my mental reconstruction of their betrayal, I'd imagined Derek as the primary aggressor, the one who'd initiated the affair, and convinced Cassandra to betray me. The idea that she'd been the architect of the whole deception was somehow both more and less hurtful than what I'd been imagining. "Why are you telling me this now?" She closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, they were bright with tears. "Because when I was lying in that car after the accident, before the paramedics arrived, all I could think about was how I'd destroyed the most important relationship in my life. For someone who doesn't even matter. Derek broke up with me 2 weeks ago. He said I was too dramatic, and that being with me made him realize he missed your stability. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so painful. Derek had left me for Cassandra, then left Cassandra because she wasn't enough like me. He kept talking about you," she continued, "about how smart you are, how focused, how you always knew what you wanted. He said dating me made him realize that he'd never really appreciated what he had with you." I sat back in the hospital chair, processing this information. Derek Morrison, the man who'd spent our entire relationship making me feel like my career goals were cute hobbies, who'd dismissed my field of study as theoretical irrelevance, who'd never shown genuine interest in my intellectual life, had apparently been comparing Cassandra unfavorably to my very qualities he'd seemed to undervalue. "Cass, I need you to know something. Derek leaving was the best thing that could have happened to me." She looked confused, like this wasn't the response she'd been expecting. 3 months ago, I was accepted for a research position with the Federal Reserve Board. I'm living in Washington now, working on financial policy that affects the entire country. If Derek hadn't left, if you had done what you did, I might have turned down the position to stay in Denver with him. I watched her process this information, saw the moment when she realized the full implications of what I was saying. "You work for the Federal Reserve? Rachel, that's incredible. That's one of the most important jobs in economics." For the first time in months, talking to Cassandra felt like talking to my sister instead of talking to someone who'd betrayed me. She was looking at me with the same admiration she'd shown when we were kids and I'd won science fairs or academic competitions, before everything became complicated by rivalry and jealousy. "I've been thinking about what you said in my apartment," I told her. "About how things just happen. You were wrong about that. Things don't just happen. People make choices, and choices have consequences. But sometimes the consequences aren't what anyone expects." We talked for another hour, not about forgiveness or reconciliation, but about the strange way our lives had diverged and intersected and diverged again. Cassandra told me about her struggles with depression since the Derek situation ended, about feeling like she'd traded her relationship with her sister for a relationship with someone who'd never really valued either of us. I told her about Washington, about the Fed, about discovering who I was when I wasn't trying to make myself smaller for someone else's comfort. By the time visiting hours ended, something had shifted between us. Not back to the way things were, too much had happened for that, but towards something that felt like it might eventually become a different kind of sisterhood. As I was getting ready to leave, Cassandra grabbed my hand weakly. "Rachel, I need you to know that I'm proud of you. I'm proud of who you've become, and I'm sorry it took me so long to see it." Flying back to Washington the next morning, I realized that the person I'd been 3 months ago, the person who'd been dating Derek Morrison and trying to fit her ambitions into someone else's limited vision, felt like a stranger now. The Federal Reserve badge in my wallet, the security clearance in my personnel file, the apartment in DuPont Circle, the work that challenged me every single day, this was the life I'd been building toward without even realizing it. Derek and Cassandra had thought they were taking something away from me. Instead, they'd freed me to become exactly who I was meant to be. The first year at the Federal Reserve transformed me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Dr. Torres quickly recognized my analytical capabilities and began assigning me increasingly complex projects. By October, I was leading a team analyzing cryptocurrency market volatility and its potential implications for traditional banking systems. By December, my research on digital payment infrastructure had been cited in Federal Open Market Committee meeting minutes. By the following spring, I was presenting analysis directly to senior Fed officials who made decisions affecting global financial markets. But the real breakthrough came in June 2020, almost exactly 1 year after Derek's betrayal. The COVID-19 pandemic had created unprecedented economic conditions, and the Fed was implementing emergency monetary policies. Unlike anything in modern financial history, interest rates had been slashed to near zero. The Fed was purchasing corporate bonds for the first time ever, and economic data was changing so rapidly that traditional forecasting models were almost useless. Dr. Chen called me into her office on a Monday morning, when Washington was still under pandemic restrictions, and most of the city felt like a ghost town. "Rachel, I've been watching your work on pandemic economic impacts, and I'm impressed with your ability to identify patterns in rapidly changing data sets," she said, gesturing for me to sit across from her desk. "I'm recommending you for a promotion to senior research economist. Effective immediately. More importantly, I'm assigning you to lead our emergency response analysis team." The promotion came with a substantial salary increase, a higher security clearance, and access to economic data that most people didn't even know existed. I was now attending briefings with Federal Reserve Bank presidents, contributing to policy discussions that would determine how aggressively the Fed should respond to the economic crisis, and working directly with officials whose decisions affected unemployment rates, inflation expectations, and the stability of the entire financial system. My apartment in DuPont Circle had been replaced by a larger place in Georgetown, walking distance from Fed headquarters and close enough to the Kennedy Center that I could attend evening concerts when my schedule permitted. The new apartment had a home office where I could work on classified analysis during the frequent occasions when 12-hour days at the Fed extended into late-night sessions at home. It was in that home office, on a rainy Thursday evening in November 2020, that I received a phone call that would change everything. "Ms. Whitmore, this is Janet Morrison from the White House Personnel Office. I'm calling regarding a potential opportunity that requires the highest level of discretion." The White House. I set down my coffee cup and straightened in my chair, suddenly very awake despite having been working since 6 a.m. "The President is considering nominating you for appointment to the Federal Reserve Board of Governors," she continued. "This would require Senate confirmation and represents one of the most influential economic policy positions in the federal government. Are you interested in being considered for this role?" Board of Governors. 7 individuals who determined monetary policy for the world's largest economy. People whose decisions affected interest rates, employment levels, and financial stability for over 300 million Americans. The kind of position that appeared in economics textbooks as the pinnacle of professional achievement in monetary policy. "Yes," I managed to say, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears. "I'm definitely interested." The vetting process that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced. FBI background checks that examined every detail of my personal and professional life. Financial disclosure requirements that accounted for every asset I owned, interviews with White House staff, Treasury Department officials, and current Fed board members. Psychological evaluations designed to assess my ability to handle the pressures of making decisions that affected global financial markets. The most challenging part wasn't the scrutiny of my qualifications or the detailed examination of my research and policy positions. It was the requirement to disclose any personal relationships or potential conflicts of interest that could complicate the confirmation process. "Tell us about your family relationships," said the White House counsel during one particularly thorough interview session. "Any complications there that could become problematic during Senate hearings." I found myself explaining Derek and Cassandra's betrayal, not because it represented a conflict of interest, but because the investigators had already discovered it during their background research and needed to understand whether it could be used against me during the political confirmation process. "So, your sister had an affair with your boyfriend, they broke up, and you've since reconciled with your sister but have no ongoing relationship with the former boyfriend," the counsel summarized. "Any chance this becomes a media distraction?" Derek Morrison is a marketing consultant in Denver who has no connection to financial policy or federal government, I replied. "He's irrelevant to my professional qualifications or my ability to serve on the Fed board." But even as I said it, I wondered what Derek would think when he eventually learned what I'd become. The woman he'd left for my sister, the woman whose career ambitions he'd dismissed as impractical academic pursuits, was about to be nominated for one of the most powerful economic policy positions in the world. The nomination was announced on a Tuesday morning in January 2021. My phone started ringing at 6 a.m. with congratulatory calls from colleagues, former professors, and economists around the country. The Wall Street Journal ran a profile describing me as a rising star in monetary policy research, with expertise in digital financial systems and crisis response analysis. The Financial Times quoted my academic work on cryptocurrency regulation. Bloomberg interviewed Dr. Chen about my qualifications and received what amounted to a glowing recommendation. But the call that surprised me most came that evening, from Cassandra. Rachel, I just saw the news. You're going to be on the Federal Reserve Board. Do you realize how incredible this is? Her voice carried a mixture of pride and amazement that reminded me of when we were children and she'd cheer for me at academic competitions. Since her accident and our hospital reconciliation, we'd been slowly rebuilding our relationship through weekly phone calls and occasional visits. When I traveled back to Denver, it wasn't the easy closeness we'd shared as kids, but it was something genuine and growing stronger over time. The Senate confirmation process could take months, I warned her. Nothing's guaranteed until I'm actually sworn in. Are you kidding? You're the most qualified person they could possibly nominate. Anyone who's paid attention to your career can see that. We talked for an hour about the nomination process, about my work at the Fed, about how different our lives had become since that awful period when Derek had been the center of both our attention. Cassandra had gone back to school for a master's degree in social work and was planning to specialize in financial counseling for low-income families. She'd found a career that combined her natural empathy with practical skills, and she seemed genuinely happy in a way I hadn't seen since we were teenagers. There's something I need to tell you, she said toward the end of our conversation. Derek reached out to me last week. He saw one of the news articles about your nomination and wanted to know if I could help him get in touch with you. My stomach tightened. I hadn't thought about Derek Morrison in months. Had successfully compartmentalized that entire chapter of my life as a learning experience that had ultimately led me toward better things. What did you tell him? I told him that you'd moved on with your life and weren't interested in reconnecting with people from your past. But Rachel, you should know what he said. He's been following your career online, reading articles about your Fed research, tracking your professional progress. He said he always knew you'd be successful, and that he made a mistake letting you go. The audacity was breathtaking. Derek had spent our entire relationship dismissing my career goals and treating my academic work like an interesting hobby. Now, faced with evidence of exactly how successful those impractical ambitions had become, he was rewriting history to cast himself as someone who'd always believed in my potential. Did he say anything else? He asked if you were dating anyone, and whether I thought you might be willing to have coffee if he came to Washington. I told him that was extremely unlikely, and that he should probably focus on his own life instead of trying to reconnect with yours. After we hung up, I sat in my Georgetown apartment, looking out at the Potomac River, and thinking about the strange circularity of life. 2 years ago, Derek's betrayal had felt like the end of everything I'd been building toward. Now, on the verge of one of the highest appointments in American economic policy, his attempt to reconnect felt like a footnote to a story that had moved far beyond him. The Senate confirmation hearings were scheduled for March. If confirmed, I'd become the youngest Federal Reserve Board member in over 50 years, and one of only a handful of women to serve in the role. The job would involve setting interest rates that affected global financial markets, regulating the largest banks in the world, and helping maintain the stability of the American economy during what promised to be a challenging period of post-pandemic recovery. But first, I had to survive the political theater of Senate confirmation, where senators from both parties would examine every aspect of my background, my qualifications, and my policy positions. Where Derek Morrison's name might very well come up as part of background investigations or opposition research, I was ready for all of it. The woman who'd been dating Derek Morrison and trying to fit her ambitions into his limited vision no longer existed. In her place was someone who understood exactly what she was capable of achieving, and wasn't interested in looking backward toward people who'd never deserved her attention in the first place. The Hart Senate Office Building in March 2021 felt like the epicenter of American political power. As I walked through the marble corridors toward the Banking Committee hearing room, flanked by White House staff and Fed officials, I could feel the weight of every decision that had led me to this moment. The confirmation hearing for my appointment to the Federal Reserve Board of Governors would be broadcast live on C-SPAN, covered by every major financial news outlet, and scrutinized by economists around the world. Senator Patricia Williams, the Banking Committee chair, had spent an hour with me the previous week going over the types of questions I could expect. The Republicans would likely focus on monetary policy philosophy and inflation concern. The Democrats would probably ask about financial regulation and economic inequality. Both sides would examine my academic record, my Fed research, and my policy positions with the kind of detailed analysis usually reserved for Supreme Court nominees. What nobody mentioned was that Derek Morrison had been trying to contact multiple news outlets about our relationship, apparently hoping to sell some kind of exclusive story about the real Rachel Whitmore before my confirmation hearing. The White House communications team had briefed me about his efforts during our final preparation session. A former boyfriend in Denver has been reaching out to reporters claiming he has insights into your character and personal history, explained Sarah Martinez, the White House deputy press secretary. None of the major outlets are interested in personal gossip about Fed nominees, but we wanted you to be aware in case it comes up. The hearing room was packed with financial reporters, Fed staff, economics professors, and representatives from banking organizations across the country. The 7-member committee sat at an elevated dais with Senator Williams in the center chair, and ranking member Senator Robert Chen arranged according to seniority. Behind me, the public gallery contained everyone from former Fed officials to graduate students who'd traveled to Washington specifically to witness this confirmation. Ms. Whitmore, Senator Williams began after the formal introductions, you've been nominated for one of the most consequential economic policy positions in our government. Please tell the committee why you believe you're qualified to help set monetary policy for the world's largest economy. I'd rehearsed this answer dozens of times, but sitting under the bright hearing room lights with cameras recording every word, I felt the full gravity of the moment. Senator Williams, members of the committee, I believe my qualifications rest on 3 pillars. First, my academic training in monetary economics and financial regulation has given me the theoretical foundation necessary to understand complex policy trade-offs. Second, my practical experience at the Federal Reserve has taught me how policy decisions translate into real-world outcomes for American families and businesses. Third, my research on emerging financial technologies has prepared me to help the Fed navigate rapidly evolving challenges in digital payments, cryptocurrency, and financial innovation. Senator Chen leaned forward, consulting his notes. Ms. Whitmore, some critics have suggested that your relative youth and limited private sector experience might be disadvantages in this role. How do you respond to concerns that you lack the seasoned judgment necessary for such consequential decisions? Senator, I would argue that diversity of experience strengthens monetary policy decision-making. The Fed benefits from having governors with different backgrounds, different perspectives, and different areas of expertise. My research focus on financial technology and crisis response brings unique insights to current challenges facing the banking system. Additionally, my generation will live with the long-term consequences of today's monetary policy decisions, which gives me a particularly strong incentive to consider their sustainability and effectiveness. The questioning continued for 3 hours, covering everything from inflation targeting strategies to bank stress testing requirements. Senator Morrison, no relation to Derek, thankfully, grilled me on cryptocurrency regulation. Senator Davis asked detailed questions about my research methodology. Senator Park wanted to know my views on climate-related financial risks. But the most challenging moment came when Senator Thompson, a Republican from Texas known for his aggressive questioning style, decided to probe my personal background. Ms. Whitmore, the committee has received some communications from individuals claiming to have personal insights into your character and decision-making processes. Without getting into inappropriate personal details, how do you respond to suggestions that your personal judgment might be questionable? I'd been prepared for this possibility, though the phrasing was more direct than I'd expected. Senator Thompson, I believe my professional record speaks for itself regarding my judgment and analytical capabilities. My personal life has always been conducted with integrity and in accordance with the highest ethical standards. If there are specific concerns about my qualifications or fitness for this position, I'd be happy to address them directly. No specific concerns, Ms. Whitmore. I'm simply noting that public service requires the highest standards of personal conduct, and Fed governors in particular must be above reproach given the sensitive nature of their responsibilities. I completely agree, Senator, and I'm confident that my record demonstrates exactly those standards. The exchange lasted less than 5 minutes, but I could see reporters in the gallery frantically taking notes. Derek's attempts to insert himself into my confirmation process had failed to generate media interest, but they'd apparently reached the committee staff's attention. During the lunch break, my White House handler pulled me aside. The committee received a packet of materials from someone named Derek Morrison in Denver, she explained quietly. Mostly rambling emails about your relationship history and claims that you're not as focused on professional responsibilities as you appear. The committee staff reviewed it and determined it was completely irrelevant to your qualifications, but they felt obligated to ask about it generally. I felt a surge of anger that Derek was still trying to interfere with my life, still attempting to diminish my achievements by reducing me to our failed relationship. But I also felt something else. A kind of incredulous amazement that he thought our brief relationship gave him any insight into my character or capabilities. The afternoon session focused on technical policy questions and went smoothly. By 4 p.m., Senator Williams was concluding the hearing with standard comments about the committee's timeline for voting on my nomination. Ms. Whitmore, thank you for your thorough and thoughtful responses today. The committee will review your testimony and supporting materials, and we expect to hold a confirmation vote within 2 weeks. As I left the Capitol building, I was immediately surrounded by financial reporters asking about my policy positions, my research priorities, and my timeline for joining the Fed board. But one question stood out from the rest. Ms. Whitmore, do you have any response to claims from individuals in your personal life that your success has changed your personality or priorities? I stopped walking and looked directly at the reporter, a young woman from Bloomberg who'd been covering Fed appointments for several years. My priorities have been consistent since graduate school, contributing to sound monetary policy and financial stability. My personality has evolved through education, experience, and professional growth, just as anyone's would. I'm proud of the person I've become and the work I've done to reach this point. That evening, I was back in my Georgetown apartment when Cassandra called. Rachel, I watched the entire hearing online. You were incredible, professional, knowledgeable, completely in command of every question they asked. Thanks, Cass. It went better than I'd hoped. I need to tell you something, though. Derek called me after the hearing. He's furious that his attempts to get media attention didn't work, and he's talking about writing some kind of blog post or social media campaign about how power has corrupted you. I sat down heavily on my couch, suddenly exhausted by Derek's persistent attempts to insert himself into my success story. What exactly does he think he's going to accomplish? I think he genuinely believed that your career success would make you want to reconcile with him, Cassandra said. When I told him that wasn't going to happen, and when his media outreach failed, he got angry. He's convinced himself that you've become someone different, someone cold and ambitious who's forgotten where you came from. The irony was perfect. Derek had spent our entire relationship encouraging me to be less focused on career goals, less serious about academic work, more spontaneous and fun-loving. Now that I'd achieved everything I'd been working toward, he was criticizing me for being exactly the ambitious, driven person I'd always been, but had tried to hide from him. Cass, I want you to know that if Derek contacts you again, you have my permission to tell him exactly how I feel about his attempts to interfere with my career. What should I tell him? I thought for a moment, looking around my Georgetown apartment at the life I'd built for myself, the policy research spread across my dining table, the Federal Reserve publications on my bookshelf, the view of the Potomac River, where I'd spent countless evenings thinking through complex economic problems. Tell him that the woman he knew in Denver no longer exists. Tell him that the person I've become, would never waste time on someone who couldn't recognize her potential when they had the chance to be part of it. And tell him that the next time he sees my name in the news, it'll be because I'm making decisions that affect the global economy, not because I'm interested in revisiting the past. 2 weeks later, the Senate Banking Committee voted 14-8 to confirm my nomination, with 3 Republicans joining all 11 Democrats in support. The full Senate confirmation vote was scheduled for the following week, but the committee approval virtually guaranteed my appointment to the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. That night, I treated myself to dinner at one of Georgetown's best restaurants, sitting alone at a corner table with a glass of wine and a feeling of completion that had nothing to do with Derek Morrison or anyone else from my past. I was 31 years old, about to join the most powerful monetary policy institution in the world, and ready to help shape economic decisions that would affect millions of Americans. Derek's attempts to diminish my achievements had failed completely. Instead, they'd reminded me exactly how far I'd traveled from the person who'd once thought his approval mattered. The swearing-in ceremony for the Federal Reserve Board of Governors took place on a crisp Monday morning in April 2021, in the Fed's boardroom, overlooking Constitution Avenue. Chief Justice Roberts administered the oath while my parents, Cassandra, Doc Chain, and a small group of Fed officials watched from the gallery. The moment felt surreal. Less than 3 years after Derek's betrayal, I was taking an oath to serve in one of the most powerful economic policy positions in the world. I, Rachel Elizabeth Whitmore, do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and that I will faithfully discharge the duties of the office of Governor of the Federal Reserve Board of the United States. After the ceremony, there was a small reception in the Fed's executive dining room. My parents were beaming with pride, taking photos with Fed officials and asking detailed questions about my responsibilities. Cassandra looked genuinely happy for me, her earlier jealousy replaced by something that felt like respect and admiration. "You know what the best part of this is?" she said quietly, while we stood by the windows overlooking the National Mall. "You did this entirely on your own. Everything you achieved came from your own work, your own intelligence, your own determination. Derek had nothing to do with any of it." She was right. The woman who'd been sworn in as a Fed governor bore almost no resemblance to the person who'd been dating Derek Morrison in Denver. That version of myself had been smaller, more uncertain, willing to minimize her ambitions to avoid threatening someone else's ego. This version knew exactly what she was capable of and wasn't interested in apologizing for her success. My first Federal Open Market Committee meeting was scheduled for the following week. I'd be sitting at the same table where decisions were made about interest rates, money supply, and financial regulation policies that affected every American household and business. The briefing materials for that meeting filled 3 binders with economic data, policy analysis, and forecasting models that would inform discussions about the nation's monetary policy direction. But before I could fully settle into my new role, I received a phone call that brought the Derek Morrison situation to its inevitable conclusion. It was a Tuesday evening in May, and I was working late in my new office at the Fed when my assistant transferred a call from someone claiming to be from a Denver television station. "Governor Whitmore, this is Jake Patterson from Channel 7 News in Denver. We're working on a story about your confirmation to the Fed board, and we wanted to get your response to some allegations that have been made about your character and background." My stomach tightened. Despite my hopes that Derek's attention-seeking behavior would fade after the confirmation hearing, apparently he'd escalated his efforts to local media. "What kind of allegations, Mr. Patterson?" "We've been contacted by Derek Morrison, who claims he was in a long-term relationship with you and has concerns about your fitness for public office. He's provided us with what he says are personal communications that show a pattern of deceptive behavior and personal instability." The audacity was breathtaking. Derek was apparently now characterizing our relationship as long-term and claiming that private conversations from years ago demonstrated unfitness for public service. "Mr. Patterson, I'm not going to comment on personal relationships from my past, but I will say that my professional qualifications and personal integrity have been thoroughly vetted by the FBI, the White House, and the United States Senate. If you have specific questions about my policy positions or professional background, I'm happy to address those. Mr. Morrison also claims that you've refused to acknowledge or discuss your past relationship, which he says demonstrates a pattern of avoiding accountability for personal decisions. This was Derek's strategy. Frame my refusal to engage with his attempts at manipulation as evidence of character flaws. It was manipulation disguised as concern for public accountability. Mr. Patterson, I'm going to end this call now, but I want you to understand something clearly. Derek Morrison was a brief relationship from my past who has no relevance to my current position or responsibilities. His attempts to insert himself into coverage of my professional achievements are inappropriate and irrelevant to any legitimate news story. I hung up and immediately called the Fed's Public Affairs Office to alert them about potential local news coverage. But I also did something else. I called Derek Morrison directly. I'd kept his number blocked on my personal phone, but my Fed office could reach any number. After 2 years of avoiding direct contact, I decided it was time to end his interference once and for all. Rachel? His voice sounded surprised, almost nervous. I didn't expect to hear from you directly. Derek, I'm calling to tell you to stop contacting media outlets about our past relationship. Your behavior is inappropriate and irrelevant to my professional responsibilities. Rachel, I think you're misunderstanding my motivations here. I'm not trying to hurt your career. I'm just concerned that success might be changing you in ways that aren't healthy. The paternalistic tone was exactly what I'd expected. Derek positioning himself as someone concerned for my well-being rather than someone desperate for attention and validation. Let me be very clear about something, Derek. You have no insight into who I am or what's healthy for me. You knew me for less than a year during a period when I was trying to make myself smaller to fit into your limited vision of who I should be. The person I've become is exactly who I was always meant to be. But Rachel, don't you think this rapid rise to power might be affecting your perspective? You used to be more grounded, more connected to regular people. I almost laughed. Derek Morrison, a marketing consultant whose biggest career achievement was managing social media campaigns for local businesses, was lecturing a Federal Reserve governor about being disconnected from regular people. Derek, my job is literally to make economic policy decisions that affect every American family. I spend my days analyzing employment data, inflation trends, and financial stability indicators that determine whether people can get jobs, buy homes, and build secure financial futures. I can't imagine work that's more connected to the welfare of regular people. There was a long pause before he responded. I think if we could talk in person, if you could step away from all this Washington power stuff for a while, you'd remember what really matters. And there it was, the core of Derek's delusion. He genuinely believed that my success was a temporary aberration, that the real Rachel was the insecure graduate student who'd been grateful for his attention and willing to minimize her ambitions for his comfort. Derek, I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. The woman you dated in Denver was playing a role. I was trying to be someone I thought you'd like, instead of being who I actually was. What you're seeing now, my career, my achievements, my confidence, this is who I really am. This is who I was before I met you, and who I became again after you left. That's not true, Rachel. I remember how you used to be. You were more fun, more spontaneous, more willing to pretend that your opinions mattered more than my career goals, more willing to laugh at your jokes about my field of study, more willing to act like federal monetary policy was a cute hobby instead of my life's calling. Another long pause. I made a mistake, Rachel. I know that now. Seeing what you've accomplished, understanding how important your work is. I realize I never appreciated what I had with you. This was the moment I'd been unconsciously waiting for since Cassandra's confession in her apartment 2 years ago. Derek Morrison, the man who'd left me for my sister because I was too serious about my career, was finally acknowledging that those very career ambitions had led to achievements beyond anything he could understand. Derek, I want you to know that your betrayal was the best thing that ever happened to me. If you hadn't left, if Cassandra hadn't interfered, I might have turned down the Fed position to stay in Denver with you. I might have spent years trying to make myself smaller to fit into your world instead of becoming exactly who I was meant to be. So there's no chance we could ever. None. Zero. The woman you think you want to reconcile with doesn't exist anymore. She was never real in the first place, and the woman I actually am would never waste time on someone who couldn't recognize her potential when he had the chance to be part of it. I hung up the phone and sat back in my chair, looking around my office at the Fed. Economic charts covered the walls. Policy briefings were stacked on my desk. Through my window, I could see the Treasury Department building where decisions were made that affected global financial markets. The Denver television story never aired. Either the station realized that Derek's allegations were baseless, or they decided that relationship drama wasn't newsworthy compared to actual policy coverage. Derek's social media posts about my transformation generated no attention beyond a few confused comments from people who had no idea what he was talking about. 6 months later, I was featured on the cover of Time magazine as one of the year's most influential people, with a profile that focused on my work modernizing Fed policy for the digital economy. The article mentioned my rapid rise through the ranks, my academic background, and my policy innovations. Derek Morrison's name appeared nowhere in the piece. That same week, Cassandra called to tell me she'd seen Derek at a coffee shop in Denver. He'd approached her apparently hoping to hear updates about my life or career. "What did you tell him?" I asked. "I told him that my sister was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do, and that the best thing that ever happened to her was realizing she didn't need his approval for any of it." Looking back now, from my office at the Federal Reserve where I help make decisions that affect the global economy, I can see that Derek's betrayal wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of everything. It was the moment I stopped trying to be someone else's version of who I should be and started becoming exactly who I was always meant to be. The woman Derek Morrison thought he knew in Denver was a fiction I'd created to avoid threatening his ego. The woman sitting in a Federal Reserve governor's chair, making monetary policy decisions that affect millions of Americans, is who I really am. And Derek Morrison's opinion about any of it stopped mattering the moment I realized I'd been wasting my potential on someone who could never appreciate it in the first place. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's simply becoming so successful that the people who hurt you become completely irrelevant to your story. Derek Morrison was a footnote in my journey to the Federal Reserve. And footnotes, by definition, are easily forgotten. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.